Anyway, um, so yeah, as you can see here, we've got pretty much all of Bob Dylan's main core studio albums up to a couple of months ago with the release of Rough and Rowdy Ways in June. And we're just going to be going through all of this, going to be perusing it over, surveying it, and giving like little mini reviews while also trying to figure out where they would rank in a decent Bob Dylan tier rank listing. Now, I will say, much like my Beatles tier list video I did, this is all obviously a mixture of like objectivity with subjectivity. I'm going to be trying to put in some of my own critical opinion and not just what is the general consensus critical opinion. To that end, what this is essentially going to be is, just like it's my own tier list of Dylan records. And in doing this, hopefully, in theory, we'll be able to get kind of at least my sort of general critical impressions on Dylan's discography. And in doing so, let us begin at a very good place to start. The first Bob Dylan album, recorded in 1961 and released in 1962. I'm prepared to, it's always hard to start a tier list. Where do you begin with the debut album? The thing with Dylan's first album is that it is very much a primitive first album. He is not coming into the record-making business yet as a songwriter. He will very swiftly become a songwriter in that traditionalist sense. He's going to become very, very prolific over the next couple of years, but when he makes his first album, he's just a young, plucky Woody Guthrie wannabe folk singer touring the coffee houses of Greenwich Village in New York, and he just wants to be, he's very much a Woody Guthrie wannabe on his first record, and as such, he just does, it's mainly a covers record to that end. There's only two main Dylan originals to speak of, and that's Talkin' New York, which is a very Woody Guthrie wannabe song, and there's Song to Woody, which is straight up a Woody Guthrie tribute song. And they're okay, but neither of which are really top-tier Dylan. A lot of what is interesting on his first record are his selections of covers, and the selections of things that he decides to lay down on record, which then will become big for other people. Like, I think probably the two most relevant recordings on Dylan's first record would be his version of In My Time of Dyin', which then Zeppelin will later expand tremendously on their Physical Graffiti album, and his version of House of Rising Sun, which then, in a couple of years, the Animals will pick up and do their own electrified version of a couple of years later, and have a huge hit with that. So there's promise on his first record, but you have to kind of search for it. It's very much it's just an average recording from who you would assume, if you were basing this off of just removing all of the, hyperbole and praise that would follow him later in his career. If you were to judge Bob Dylan off of just his first album alone, you would judge him as pretty typical average folk singer of the early 60s, but nothing too remarkable. So because of that, because of the promise that is there on the record, because of the fact that a lot of people took what was on the first record and got some decent mileage of it for their own interpretations later, but also because it doesn't have a lot of the classic trademarks of what makes Dylan Dylan, I'm pretty comfortable in placing first album in the C tier. I think it's very, very comfortably average Bob Dylan. Nothing too awful, but nothing too grandiose and spectacular either. Which then brings us to album number 2, the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. Now this, for all intents and purposes, the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan album is where Dylan, the songwriter, poet laureate, Nobel Prize winning composer, his career really starts on album number 2. I mean, like, just when you think of the amount of classic songs on his second album, Blowin' in the Wind, Girl from North Country, Masters of War, Don't Think Twice, It's Alright, A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Oxford Town, Karina, you know, like, Down the Highway. There's all sorts of, like, just amazing stuff. It's incredible to think that he was only, like, about 21, 22 when he recorded this album. It's definitely the one that put him into the critical lens and started the ball rolling on people calling him the voice of a generation, or the spokesman of a generation, or leader of the counterculture, or all those sort of things. These labels that he never wanted, but got foisted upon him. I would say if there's any detriment to the freewheeling Bob Dylan, and this is going to be something which happens a couple of times here and there in his discography, with me in the freewheeling Bob Dylan, it is a good album. I like it a lot. It's got tons of classic stuff on it. Where it loses me personally is in the songs which are definitely of its time. By which I mean tracks like, say, I Shall Be Free, the closer track, or Talkin' World War III Blues. These sort of songs which are definitely Cold War, early 60s Kennedy administration writings. They are definitely written in 1962 and 1963. And they sound like they were written and performed in 1962 and 1963. They're definitely of their time. The thing that Dylan will become great at later in his career will be tackling political issues from a broader sense, in so much that he will make a political statement within a song, but he doesn't point it directly to when it was written or recorded. He makes it more universal by being more poetic with the lyric. And, you know, there is a very decent debate that could be had about whether or not that dilutes the political message behind the songs. But for me, it's one of those things like Hard Rain's Gonna Fall is definitely, like, for example, that's a example of a song which, when it came out at the time, people could very easily relate it to the civil rights movement, to the Cold War, to the fear of nuclear apocalypse, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, to all sorts of different things that were happening within the early 60s. And yet, that's never explained, or that's never implicitly stated. There's not a moment where Dylan, like in Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, specifically goes, this is what this is about, and this is how I feel on it, and blank is good and blank is bad. He takes it from a angle of, here's a list of vivid imagery that I am going to lay upon you within this song. I'm going to give you this epic tone poem set of lyrics, and I'm going to illustrate to you all these different images which can mean different things based off of how you interpret them. They mean something to me now, they mean something to the listener now, but they will mean something different in 20 years' time, in 50 years' time. And in doing that, he writes material which lasts longer. You know, Blowin' in the Wind, when it came out in 63, hugely contemporary. Very contemporary song, talking about very specific things, you know. How many roads must a man walk down before you can call him a man, you know? That sort of stuff is very, very emblematic of, you know, the sort of the civil rights crisis, the treatment of black Americans within, you know, the country in the early 60s and now as well. You know, those sort of things of, you describe a struggle, you paint a picture of a struggle, but because you don't say, here's where we are in 1963, it's just posing the questions of, what do you make of this? That sort of stuff makes that song like Blowin' in the Wind, you know, like, how many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? That can be about anything. That could be about the Cold War. That could be about World War II. That could be about the Korean War. That could be about Vietnam. That could be about the Gulf crisis. That could be about where we're at right now in the Middle East and all these sort of things. That can be applied to a wide variety of issues because the message remains constant and same throughout history, and that's, to me, the best kind of political songwriting is the songwriting that says it isn't about just right now. It's about now and then and in the future and all time. And what we're going to be talking about in this instance are topics and issues which have a huge pervasive feeling throughout history and will continue to have those feelings if we do not address them and if we don't make change, if we don't take the effort to make the change. Those are the good political songs. The bad ones are when, it's, talking World War III blues and he's like, sort of, he picks up the phone or the telephone operator saying it'll be 3:00 and turns on the radio, Rock-a-Day Johnny singing, tell your ma, tell your pa, all ours are gonna grow, ooh-ah, ooh-ah, or And I Shall Be Free. President Kennedy calls him up and says, what do we need to make the country grow? And then Bob says to him, Bridget Bardot, Sophia Loren, the country will grow. Like, that's all that is very much of those name dropping and those references and the joke around all that stuff. Like, those are very much of their time, and because of that, they don't age as gracefully. They age quicker, and their impact lessens. Whereas with stuff like, say, Masters of War, where he just is going after all of the politicians and the warmongers and the fearmongers and the people who lead us into unnecessary wars. Those are the targets. And he's not saying you specific person. He's saying all of you as a group are guilty of this, and you are causing these things to happen, and you have throughout time, and you will again. And that is the best kind of political material. So anyway, that also applies to album 3, which we'll reach in a little bit of time here. So then let's getting that out of the way, let's talk then about what Freewheelin' Bob Dylan is. As it stands, I am prepared to, at the moment, put it in probably the A tier, because it has aged. It's aged a bit. But here's the thing. Even after I go on that whole spiel about, how I view political songwriting, all that stuff, the thing with it is that Freewheelin' Bob Dylan is really where the legacy commences, and it's where the whole sort of shift toward not just Dylan being viewed of as a songwriter, but also where now the age of the singer-songwriter is going to start arriving in its wake too. You had to figure as well, this is still in the age of pop records being Tin Pan Alley. Freewheelin' Bob Dylan comes out in early '63 alongside records from England, and like they don't become big in America till a year later, but with the simultaneous arrival in early '63 of Freewheelin' Bob Dylan and Please Please Me by the Beatles, now we're seeing the end of that sort of Tin Pan Alley songwriting expectation in pop music. Now we're going to see the rise of the singer-songwriter movement, and with it, the expectation that the real legitimate musicians and artists are going to be expected to write their own material, perform their own material, and sing it from the heart. And that is what happens on Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. And it causes a shift from performers being just faces you put on a stage and go, oh, nice face, good voice, that's it. Now it's going to be, no, I have a statement to make, and that's what it'd be. So in that sense, I'm willing to put Freewheelin' in the A tier. Even though I think it's aged a little bit, the worth of the best of the material and the impact it had on the industry is enough to put it really, really high up there. Not maybe S tier for me, but A tier certainly. All right. And that leads into The Times They Are Changin', which is the third record. So all the stuff I said earlier about how political songwriting can age very quickly. Times They Are Changin' is perhaps the most guilty of that avenue in Dylan's entire discography. Now, mind you, it still works. A lot of it still works. The title track, Times They Are Changing, keeps popping up again and again and again and again and again, because every single time social movements crop up, like demanding change, everyone likes to pull out Times They Are Changing, because they are. They always are changing. Time is ever changing. That's the whole point of time. But beyond the iconic title track, you've got stuff like Ballad of Hollis Brown, which is this like really gloomy, like dark tale of, a guy destitute and like at his wit's end, trying to like keep his family warm and well fed. You've got The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, which is a haunting imagery, a haunting tale of, that sort of the prejudice of, I'm trying to use my words carefully because but like that sort of imagery of the well-off racist with like money to spend, coming from the rich background, attacking the poor, like in a racist attack, attacking the poor black, hotel maid or whatever, and then getting off pretty much, like only 6 months for murder because he's white and the courts are biased and he has the money to post bail. That is a very haunting song, which still holds relevance today. And then you've also got things like With God on Our Side, which talks about how in America we get brainwashed, or brainwashed and sort of fed the narrative that, because we are, of Western civilization, we have, God on our side, and this is the whole, like phrase that we hear all the time with, like we're taught through history. We were always right when fighting our wars, and we always have, the sanctity of the above on our side because we are naturally inclined to be the force of good and everyone else around us is the force of evil. That cultural imperialism which feeds the war machine in the West, he pins that to the wall and says, well, that's bullshit too. And then there's the more general songs as well on there. You've got One Too Many Mornings, which is a really great track. You've got Boots of Spanish Leather, which is a really great track. There's a couple of songs he cut during those sessions which I think are a little bit better than others, just because they feel a bit more fleshed out on a poetic sense. Like Percy's song was a great song that didn't make it on the record. Moonshiner is a great song that didn't make it on the record. Lay Down Your Weary Tune is a great song which didn't make it on the record. So to a degree, the songwriting takes a bump up. Like to a little bit of a degree, it takes a bump up in the quality, but it doesn't necessarily. It's a bit more monochromatic. The sense of humor that kind of existed in Freewheelin' has been sidelined because now Dylan's expected to be the champion of all social causes, as a role designated onto him by Pete Seeger and Theodore Bikel and all of those from the very, all the like folk singers and folk promoters who were expecting to change the world through folk songs or modern folk songs, and we're putting putting him up as the grand elder statesman. Not elder statesman, he was only like 22 or 23, but the new voice that was going to really shake the world, the foundations of the world to their core. It makes for a good record, but a bit more of a monochromatic record, I would say, to some degree. It's definitely like just a gloom. There's a gloom over the record, which really makes it challenging listening on occasion. And so it's a harder one to really dive your teeth into. But I would say Probably I would put it B tier. I would say after all that discussion, I would say that it's better than the first album, but not as good as Freewheelin'. It lacks freewheelin' attitude, and that's to its detriment. But that comes back because then in '64 we get Another Side of Bob Dylan, the next record, and the final album that comes out of Dylan's traditional folk singer period. Now, the interesting thing about Another Side is that within the span of time between when he recorded the Times They Are Changing album in 1963 and when he records Another Side in 1964, Dylan begins a metamorphosis. He starts consciously shedding his old image of being the grand political songwriter. He, stops wearing these, like, tan clothes and starts, like, buying some real fashionable outfits, like these really nice suede coats and these, leather shoes and all these things. And he also starts taking influence from the British invasion to some degree. And in doing so, he starts moving his lyrics more into the abstract. The most overtly political song, I would say, is Chimes of Freedom Flashing. And even then, it's not a statement on any cause. It's more his own sort of like on the road Jack Kerouac vision of his viewpoint of America. And it's told in this grand 8-minute long narrative of just wild imagery. Beyond that, you have songs like To Ramona or sort of I Don't Believe You, She Acts Like We Never Have Met, or It Ain't Me, Babe. He's integrating more of the love songs into his canon. And in doing so, he's bringing back the humor which was missing on The Times They Are Changing. What is intriguing to me about a lot of Another Side of Bob Dylan is that I think it's very, very good. I think it's a great record. But it sits in this awkward space where a lot of the songs would become fodder for other artists to take, to electrify, and then turn into the folk rock genre. Like, I would say probably about half of the Another Side of Bob Dylan album was at one point or another covered by the Byrds, on different albums. But I mean, just on Another Side of Bob Dylan alone. The Byrds covered All I Really Want to Do, Spanish Harlem Incident. They covered Chimes of Freedom, and they covered My Back Pages. So that's 4 of the 10, I think. There's either 10 or 11 tracks on that album, but that's nearly half the album was recorded in different stages by the Byrds. So in that sense, Another Side of Bob Dylan becomes very, very good as a template for songs, but I think a lot of what is available on that record is performed better in different versions by either different artists or by Dylan himself later in his career. So I think it's better than Times They Are Changing. I'm tentatively putting it in the B category for right now, just because I think Freewheelin' is still superior to it, and because there's so much promise on Another Side that I think gets realized later on down the line by different people. It's a record which is interesting to listen to, but it's a transitional effort. At the end of the day, it's a transitional effort that Dylan will top later, which he does pretty promptly with Bringing It All Back Home. Bringing It All Back Home is where things start to get wild. So it's like Another Side of Bob Dylan, Bringing It All Back Home is to a degree a transitional album, though a more drastic transitional album, in so much that the first side of the album has Dylan being backed up by a rock band. He brings in a group of session players and some fellow friends from the folk clubs to back him up, and he starts recording heavier, rockier, poppier material like Subterranean Homesick Blues, or She Belongs to Me, or Maggie's Farm, or Love Minus Zero No Limit, or She Belongs to Me, or Outlaw Blues, or Bob Dylan's 115th Dream, or even the outtakes like If You Gotta Go, Go Now, or Else You Gotta Stay All Night. he's making what is more of a pop inclinated album. If you got a sense on the lyrics and melodies of Another Side of Bob Dylan that he was starting to get influenced by the Beatles, you really get the sense that with Bringing It All Back Home, he's decided, no, I kind of want to move more into the rock direction. I think I'm going to be able to do a little bit more with it. And he does. Though then, he doesn't follow up on it all the way, is the thing. Because then the second half of the album, side 2, is all acoustic stuff in the same way as his previous 4 albums were. Though definitely elevated up in terms of the lyrical content. I mean, side 2 of Bring It All Back Home might very well be the best acoustic folk material Dylan ever wrote in his life. Mr. Tambourine Man, Gates of Eden, It's Alright Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, It's All Over Now Baby Blue. For most people, to write 4 songs like that would be an entire career. And they're all packed onto the second half of Bringing It All Back Home. And it's incredible. It marks the end of an era. I mean, certainly It's All Over Now Baby Blue can stand as sort of Dylan's bowing out of the first part of his career before he totally shifts gears on the next coming records. But it's hard. It's hard to say. I'm inclined at the moment. I could end up eating my words here, but I think I'm prepared to put Bringing It All Back Home in the S tier. It is where the game shifts. It is really where the game definitively shifts. And now Bob Dylan on the previous albums has shown that performers can be songwriters and that they can write and that songs can exist which tackle the social ills of the day. On Bringing It All Back Home, Dylan says pop music can become intellectual. It can become intellectual, it can be smart, it can be about something. It doesn't have to be just, like verse, chorus, verse about boy meet girl love or fall out love lyrics. They can start getting more abstract and more poetic, and you had to think about them. You have to sort of sit with them and really think on what does this conjure in your mind, what imagery does this convey. And the end result of that is that you got the start of the rise of what was, for many people, the golden age of rock and roll music. And the golden age of pop music, almost. Because that now we've gone from treating pop music as simple novelty into artistic statement. And that's a major advancement in the course of the history of pop music. And so, he follows up on that with Highway 61 Revisited. Let's just cut through it. Let's not beat around the bush too much. S tier. Pretty easy selection for S tier. What can I say about Highway 61 Revisited that hasn't already been talked about at length by many other people? It opens with Like a Rolling Stone, and that drum snare. I mean, it was Bruce Springsteen who said that the opening snare drum of Like a Rolling Stone was like someone kicking the door open to your mind. And he's not wrong. It definitely feels that way. I think here's what I'll talk about with Highway 61 Revisited. I don't think people ever acknowledge the fact that it is in many ways a concept album. Not intentionally a concept album, that's not the right word, but not explicitly a concept album. It's not like, a rock opera that tells a story, or even a kind of, concept album like Sgt. Pepper, which the conceit is just the very flimsy, it's a band and you're seeing all the different acts come on the stage. Highway 61 Revisited is a concept album in so much as that it revels in the outsiders of society. It talks about being on the outskirts, being on the outcast, being kind of outside of the mainstream. Which is ironic because, Dylan was getting so much flack at the time from people for supposedly going mainstream by turning his music more electric and more rock and roll based. And yet, if you really think about it, it is an album filled with references and commentary on these sort of cast-off societal bohemians. You've got the amazing put down of Like a Rolling Stone. How does it feel to be on your own with no direction home? You get Tombstone Blues, this like strange melange of characters doing strange random things. You got the kind of bluesy dirge of It Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry. Ballad of a Thin Man is a total attack on these, like, you know, on people like, say, me, you know, who, but not, you know, like, so all those, like, sort of critical commentators who are very well read and well literate, and they think they've got the key to piecing together what art is and how art should be viewed and what it all means, and they kind of turn askance at stuff that comes out which is new and original because they can't relate it to what they already know in their mind, you know? You know that something's happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? That kind of, like, something is happening. You're in the midst of something fresh and new, and you're trying to figure out what it is. You're trying to get a grip on where you are and the ground beneath you, and you just can't reach it because it is so beyond your grasp. You're so set in tradition and you know, form and function that you can't really process what happens when something original or new comes along and totally changes the whole scene, changes the whole outlook on everything. It's really a, you know, profound state. And then even beyond that, you've got Queen Jane, approximately this, like, description of a worn down, sort of cast aside beauty queen. Highway 61 Revisited is this, like, collection of oddball characters looking to get strange things done, and then they all get sent off to the mythical Highway 61, the road where Robert Johnson supposedly sold his soul on the crossroads so he could play the blues. This sort of, like, twisted form of Americana that's both simultaneously contemporary and ancient and reveled in folklore, but given a kind of 20th century pop art twist to it. And by the end of the album, all these people, all these strange cast-offs of modern society and outsider society and these sort of folks who don't belong or don't fit in, they all get rounded up to Desolation Row and sent to this, like, sort of strange, apocalyptic, like, horror nightmare of a neighborhood, you know, where all this crazy stuff is going on and people are, like, onlooking from the sidelines going, this is insane, what's happening here, you know? Like, that is all of Highway 61 Revisited. The whole album has this tinge of, let's revel now in the absolute pits of society, and not just low society or whatever, but high society. We're going to look at all these sort of, like, fake tenets of pop culture, pop art, literature, high society, and we're just gonna rip it all apart and just rip it to shreds. And it really does. It makes a change. It really does make a sort of... It leaves an impression which makes it resonate. And then that's also putting aside the fact that it really was the moment when Dylan went rock and didn't look back, and also just, like, set the standard so high. Like, to come out in mid-1965 when the pop charts were still, you know, like Be My Baby or Wanna Hold Your Hand, or, you know, some of those had come out a couple years before. But there was a lot of junk on pop music radio, and for a track like a Rolling Stone to come out around that time and just, you know, throw you to the curb. It just would. It would throw you to the curb and be like, holy cow, I can't believe what I'm hearing, it is truly a masterpiece. It is a masterpiece to some degree. I will say, if I have my own subjective criticism, it's that I am not the biggest fan of the band he has on it. I think Mike Bloomfield was a bit of a showboat guitarist, and the rhythm section of the drummer and the bass player never seemed to be gelling together. I think they were members of the Butterfield Blues Band, but I could be wrong about that. I don't know if they actually were or not. So, but I mean, just it's a superb record. It is absolutely superb and belongs up there in the S tier. And also, by that same token, moving right along with it, I'm prepared to do this without any great qualm. Blonde on Blonde is S tier as well. To me, if Highway 61 Revisited is the masterpiece for having Like a Rolling Stone on it, and Ballad of a Thin Man, and songs like Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues, or Desolation Row, or Tombstone Blues, or all these things, if it changed the game, it set the standards way up high, it said, look, pop music can be intellectual, treat it as such. Blonde on Blonde, to me, is the definitive Dylan album. And maybe I'll be proven wrong here, but for my money, it really is the quintessential record of Bob Dylan. He has a different backing band. He records most of the album in Nashville in 1966, and in doing so, he gets a different set of players to play along with him. And it provides a slicker surface. It's not as rough-edged as Highway 61 Revisited. It's certainly more produced. But that is honestly to its benefit, because the songs are still just as wild as ever. And the lyrics are perhaps some of the most obtuse stuff Dylan ever wrote, you know? There's tracks like One of Us Must Know Sooner or Later. A lyric like... And then you told me later, as I apologized, that you were just kidding me, you weren't really from the farm. And I told you as you clawed out my eyes that I never really meant to do you any harm. That's genius. That's absolutely amazing. I mean, because what does that even mean? You know, like, that's kind of like one of those lyrics that, like, you get an emotional feeling out of that. Like, it's a love song of failure, but also, like, what kind of discussion is that Dylan's having with this person where, you know, you were just kidding me, you weren't really from the farm? Like, so was he looking for a farmer? And then the person he's talking to is... Oh, no. Like, he's then apologizing later, and the person who he's talking to is busy clawing his eyes out, so he's being attacked. And while he's being attacked, he's saying, you know, I never really meant to do you any harm. His eyes are being gouged out while he says it. I mean, that's a, like, weird-ass lyric, you know? If you really pick that apart. And the whole album is like that, you know? Visions of Johanna's got jewels and binoculars hang from the head of the mule, you know. And Madonna, she still has not showed. We see this empty cage now corrode, where the cape of the stage once had flowed. The fiddler, he now steps to the road. He writes, everything's been returned which was old on the back of the fish truck that loads while my conscience explodes. Like, that's the abundance of lyrics on this album that just throw you for a ringer and just make you go, what does that mean? You know? And it's like, it's impossible to parse out the meaning of it, but yet the way he performs it and the tonality of his voice and the tonality of the band and the way it's produced and the sequencing and the artwork production, and that's putting aside too the fact that it was also the first like double album in rock music. There were a couple of double albums that had come out before that, but they were like jazz records or they were compilations. You know, I think the only real compilation album that had come out before that was a double album. Maybe been a couple like Chuck Berry Greatest Hits or something like that. And even then, that is up in the... I'm not really sure on the dates of all that, but like, this was the first double album double studio album in rock and roll. And it was, every single track was a highlight. Like, there was no missteps anywhere. It was all incredible. And to me, Dylan also found this interesting tonality in his voice on this album and this album alone. I think that's very interesting. You know, the common impression of Dylan is you do it this way, this kind of whiny thing. That is only on Blonde on Blonde. He has a different voice on all of the other albums he put out. But on Blonde in specific, you have that classic, like, sort of velvety whine that he's got this, like, has this, like, interesting pronounced drawl, which may be, you know, the result of the substances he was taking at the time, but also just might be, he was just this, like, wild ball of electricity while he was making Blonde on Blonde. To this day, I mean, it's hard. It's hard for me to say what my favorite Dylan album is, but I think Blonde on Blonde possibly really takes the cake. It's up there. It's up there as one of his finest efforts, and I think as the culmination of his the first era of his career, I think it's a masterpiece. I think at the end of the day, if Highway 61 Revisited did more for the course of music, I think Blonde on Blonde is the album that people quintessentially think of when they think of Bob Dylan. They think of Blonde on Blonde. And on that note, we then move on. We're going to skip ahead a little bit here in the discography. We're going to move into 1975 in terms of release date, but 1967 in terms of recording, to the Basement Tapes. Now, the Basement Tapes are a tricky situation because their release is kind of, well, for one thing, let's talk about the fact. So, in 1966, Dylan puts out Blonde on Blonde. He goes on this world tour of Australia and Europe and England. He's being booed everywhere for being a supposed sellout because he's playing electric music and not remaining the folk singer he was on Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. And then right in the midst of this, he gets in a motorcycle crash and disappears from public life, never really to return again. To this day, like, Dylan is one of those rare examples of someone who can live in the age of social media and smartphone and still be a relative recluse. We still really don't know that much about Bob Dylan. And he is alive today, and we still don't know much about him. And you would think, after all these tabloids and stuff about, we would have a better clue of who this guy really is, and we don't. And the myth around Dylan really starts with the Basement Tapes. And that's because he does record it in a basement. He records it in the basement of this tiny house in the middle of the woods in Woodstock called Big Pink. He's backed by the members of his touring band, who at the time are called the Hawks, but during the sessions they're going to change their name to the Band and become one of the most supremely beloved roots rock bands of the 20th century. And he writes these sort of, like, stripped down stories of, like, rustic life in the countryside, while also giving them this obtuse poetic edge, which is typical of Blonde on Blonde. So he's in sort of this, like, nebulous state when he makes the Basement Tapes. There's songs like The Mighty Quinn, or You Ain't Going Nowhere, or I Shall Be Released. Vivid imagery, vivid lyrics, vivid melodies, and yet they're rooted in a sort of classic Americana, which wasn't as readily present on Blonde or on Highway 61 or Bringing It All Back Home. He's kind of bringing back the old book of folk music again, but he's not making an artistic return to this old sound. It's an interesting sort of dynamic where he's kind of pulling away from the rambunctious rock and roll of his previous three albums, but he's not giving in to the demands of the folkies who are walking out of his concerts. Because the Basement Tapes songs sound nothing like Freewheelin', or Times They Are Changing, or Another Side of Bob Dylan. They sound like their own entity that's kind of removed from contemporary sounds. It's like he's recording this in the midst of the summer of love, and this is in the era where the Beatles are putting out Sgt. Pepper and the Stones are putting out their Satanic Majesties, and Hendrix is hitting the scene, and you've got the Monterey Pop Festival going on, and the Jefferson Airplane are coming out, Janis Joplin's coming out, the Doors are coming out, like all this whole shift towards really loud, outrageous psychedelics, and Dylan goes, now I'm gonna make like a kind of country record, not totally country, but I'm just gonna strip it down a bit, gonna bring my acoustic guitar out, it's gonna be very laid back dynamics, and that sort of stuff really starts playing into like what he's on about. It's an interesting thing because it's so removed from everything else that's happening around him and the sound that his contemporaries are making, that it really becomes like this own self-contained piece, which some people don't enjoy. I've heard many people review the Basement Tapes and go, this is crap, it's lo-fi, it doesn't sound finished, it sounds like rough demos, it isn't what I want to hear from Dylan, it's this like weird country rock stuff, what is this about? But for someone like me who lives in the woods and grew up in a kind of more rustic rural environment, I've never really spent I haven't grown up in like big cities like New York or LA or all that stuff. I've been very much in like what is called heartland America. For me, it really just speaks to like sort of the stuff that I have grown up with. That kind of rustic, like you drive around the place and there's a farm here and there's people on tractors here. It's very simple, rustic, rural stuff, which I can relate to. Even if I'm not, I don't identify with that sort of stuff either. Like it paints an image in my head, and also just the dynamic of the sound and the way it was recorded. There's something really, really pleasant about. Just this kind of what is it? What would be the word? It's sort of, there's something really pleasant about just the clubhouse way in which Dylan and the band make their stuff, in so much that like you get the sense that they're just letting loose, that they're relaxing, that they aren't approaching this with professionalism, and that is to its benefit, because there's an image with the Basement Tapes to me that gets conjured up a lot, which I really, really like, which is this feeling of musicians just getting together, shooting the shit, hanging out, having fun, telling jokes, and then they get together, they go down into the studio in the basement, plug in their instruments, and just turn on the tape machine, and just let it all hang out, let it fly, see what comes out. And that's always kind of been what I really, really respect in artistic creativity anyway. Like, that's kind of what I would want my own artistic process to be like, or to be similar to. So, for me, it's a really, really good album. And is it... Now, here's actually no, because I need to talk about this too. So here's the thing. I like Dylan's stuff, but if we're talking about the Basement Tapes as a record and what it came out as in 75, the way it was released, I think, was poor. It didn't come out in 67. It came out in 75, so way, way late into Dylan's career and way, way late into the band's career as well. And Robbie Robertson took over the production helm. He filled the record with band outtakes and with new material for the band to put out. And in doing so, he made it a more... There's a greater dichotomy in the record, because whereas Dylan's songs are all of a piece and of a feeling and of a mood, the band just kind of are slotted in there. The band were present during those sessions, obviously, and a lot of the best work that they came up with during that time they were hanging with Dylan would come out on their first two albums, Music from Big Pink and the self-titled Band album. But on the Basement Tapes, they never congeal into a really dynamic, unified listening experience. They're just kind of inserted in there by the behest of the producer, who's trying to give the band a greater boost in relevance and popularity before they make the Northern Lights Southern Cross album and do The Last Waltz. So, as the record that it came out as in 75, I would probably put it in the B tier. I would say probably above Another Side of Bob Dylan, just because Dylan's material on the record is just so good and so fantastic. But it's not a unified listen, and that's to its detriment. If we were judging it solely off of the Dylan material, I would put it probably A tier or maybe even S tier. But as the record it came out as, it's most likely a B tier record. And then we flash back, even though this is the next record that was recorded, but we flash back to the way, way more to when it was released. John Wesley Harding. So despite the Basement Tapes being like the sort of change that they are, the transition from the wild rambunctiousness of the Electric trilogy into the sound he will develop over the course of the next coming decades, the first thing that the public gets after Blonde on Blonde is John Wesley Harding. And it comes out in December 67 in America and January 68 in England. And it is just, it throws everyone for a loop. Because everyone's expecting Dylan to be part of the counterculture. They're expecting him to be leading up all the protests and the social causes that are happening in the 60s. There's that classic poster of Dylan that it gets included in his first greatest hits album that comes out in between Blonde on Blonde and John Wesley Harding. There's that classic poster of the silhouette of Dylan, this like illustrated silhouette, and his curly hair being illustrated by these like rainbow stripes that look like something out of Yellow Submarine. And that's the expectation that people are foisting onto Dylan while he's recovering from his motorcycle crash. So he comes out with John Wesley Harding, which sounds nothing like Blonde on Blonde, or Highway 61, or Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, or Times They Are Changin'. It sounds like he made a country record, because he made a country record. He made this album, John Wesley Harding, with Nashville players in a Nashville studio. And these songs are very twangy. They're short. They're concise. The lyrics on them aren't as obtuse. They're very direct, but they also are very mysterious, and they're shrouded in this cloak of mystery, It's a kind of interesting situation where he's writing almost like these biblical parables. I dreamed I saw St. Augustine. Drifters escape. I pity the poor immigrant. The Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest. Like these very... The Wicked Messenger. Like there's all these very like sort of tales from like another time and place kind of feel to it, even more so than the Basement Tapes, because the Basement Tapes they were different than 67, but they were just sort of like the end result of, you got this vibe with the Basement Tapes recordings that it was Dylan and the band getting together at Big Pink and just going into the basement and jamming, and what you got on the record was the end result of just musicians having fun. John Wesley Harding is more serious and even more out of place than the Basement Tapes, because it's not only that he's really simplified his sound down to a drastic degree, but the lyrics are now really about stuff that feels like out of the 1800s and even the early 1800s, like almost pre-Civil War stuff, or that kind of westward expansion moving into the gold rush of California kind of feeling. It's very hard to describe. And to some degree, it still is like very hard to unravel. It takes a couple of listens to really get John Wesley Harding and to really get into it and agree with it. It's a hard record to settle with. But then at that same token, like it held a huge impact on people. I mean, it's got All Along the Watchtower on it. All Along the Watchtower is an example of, like, All Along the Watchtower is a prime example of what John Wesley Harding is like. It is simple. 3 chords to All Along the Watchtower. The 3 chords of All Along the Watchtower, it goes in like... Like, that is it. It is C sharp minor, B, and A. And it never shifts from that, ever. Song never changes from those 3 chords. And the melody and the lyric is a very quickly told parable. There must be some way out of here, said the Joker to the priest. There's too much confusion, I can't get no release. Businessmen, they drink my wine, plowmen dig my earth, none of them along the line know what any of it is worth. No reason to get excited, the Fifi kindly spoke. There are many here among us who feel that life is but a joke. But you and I, we've been through that, and this is not our fate, so let us not talk falsely now. The hour is getting late. Like, that's sort of... It's written as if it's like a parable inscribed on like a scroll from the ancient past, and yet you don't know what it's about. You don't know what's happening. You know that something mysterious is happening, or something dangerous and spooky is taking place, and it just sits on those 3 chords. And then, it's very simple, could be Western, could be something else. The next year, in 1968, Hendrix puts it on Electric Ladyland, and he's totally transformed it into and then he plugs it in, ratchets up the sound, makes it electric, turns the volume to 11, and then boom, it sounds like the apocalypse is coming. And then you put that against like what's happening in Vietnam and everyone being sent off over there. There must be some way out of here. It was a big deal for the counterculture in that era. So, with all that being said, John Wesley Harding, where do I place it? I like the album, but it's a bit too lean for my tastes. And its mysteriousness, I think, is sometimes to its detriment. It's hard to say. I like it more than Freewheelin'. Personally, subjectively, I like it more than Freewheelin'. But in terms of what it means in Dylan's discography and what it meant for the pop culture at large, I think I may have to put it in B tier. And that surprises me. That honestly surprises me a little bit because I like it more than Freewheelin'. As a listening experience, I prefer it to Freewheelin'. But I think Freewheelin' did more for music in general and more for Dylan. And I think the highs on Freewheelin' are just higher than the ones on John Wesley Harding. But that's not to take away from what John Wesley Harding is. It's a very, very, very good album. But, I would have to put it in B tier. And that surprises me. Now, from this, in John Wesley Harding, Dylan takes the bulk of 1968 off. There's reports circling around that he experiences a bit of a dry spell during 1968. In the time that happens, the basement tapes start getting leaked via bootlegs, and so the myth around Dylan starts growing more and more and more. In 1969, he comes out with Nashville Skyline. Now, whereas the basement tapes and John Wesley Harding hinted at country, there's no mistaking Nashville Skyline for anything than what it is. It's a country album. It is a straight-up country album. It's under half an hour long. It opens with a duet version of Girl from the North Country with Johnny Cash. And most strikingly, Dylan's voice has completely shifted. Again, the most readily identifiable part of Bob Dylan's voice, as anyone will tell you, is that it's rough and coarse, and sometimes hard to listen to, very abrasive. Nashville Skyline comes out, and he has got this most smooth, gentle croon you've ever heard. And it's actually kind of off-putting. It's a little bit off-putting because you're like, this doesn't sound like Bob Dylan. It sounds like a different human being recorded this. So then it's like this interesting kind of state of confusion where He's made an out-and-out country album. He doesn't sound like Bob Dylan. It's incredibly short, especially when you consider in 1969 we were getting records like Abbey Road or Tommy or Let It Bleed or or In the Court of the Crimson King or we're starting to see the rise of prog, rise of hard rock, rise of metal, rise of all these things. Like the first two Zeppelin albums come out around that time. So people are really starting to hunker down on record production. Nashville Skyline is 28 minutes and pretty thin on the production end too. Very, very lo-fi country album. It is a hard one to piece together, and it coming at the end of the decade too. And '69 is the year of the moon landing in Woodstock and Altamont and Charles Manson and all these crazy things going on, and the Nixon administration taking over the White House. It's just it is not at all what anyone's expecting from Dylan. It's grown in people's viewpoint over the years as being a really nice kind of Tin Pan Alley album. There's songs on it like I Threw It All Away or To Be Alone With You. Very traditional, country tunes that don't really break from the form too much. Obviously, Lay Lady Lay became a humongous classic hit for people. And there's Tonight I'll Be Staying Here With You, which I think is done better on live tapes than it is on the studio record. From my own subjectivity, I think I probably am going to have to put Nashville Skyline in the C tier. And I'm doing this kind of getting this vision in my head. The same way I kind of put, when I did the Beatles tier list, I kind of put Help toward the bottom end of things. I can already see now people kind of getting mad at me with putting Nashville Skyline at C tier. But it's just, I don't know. For me, it's a very confusing album. It's very hard to parse. I think it's still above his first album. I'll say that much. I think it's still above the debut because it's all original still. But I don't know. Dylan's country era was never my favorite. When he blended it, when he did that kind of country roots rock thing on the Basement Tapes or on John Wesley Harding, I could stand it a whole lot more. But Nashville Skyline's just out and out trying to be like a Johnny Cash record or something, and it doesn't work for me. It doesn't scan as well as it does for other people. Here's an uncontroversial opinion, I think. Boop. Let's put Self-Portrait in F. There was a classic. So, I think the most I need to say about Self-Portrait. Let me see if I can pull it up here. There was, I remember reading Bob Dylan's Chronicles book. And let me see if I have it. I believe I do. It would be right around here, wouldn't it? Yeah. Is this the page? Maybe it's further deeper in. I want to pull up this one quote of Dylan's, which I think will really explain everything I need to say about everything that needs to be said with Self-Portrait. It's somewhere here. I was right, though. I was right where it was. Let's see here. I'll get to this in a moment. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this is taking... It's hard. It's hard to find this. If I had this in an actual book, I would be doing this better, but, let's see here. Oh, there it is. Found it. All right. So here's the quote. Here's the quote from Bob Dylan in his own book, Chronicles, Volume 1. This is everything I need to say about Self-Portrait. And this is from the words of the man himself. I released one album, a double one, where I just threw everything I could think of at the wall, and whatever stuck, released it, and then went back and scooped up everything that didn't stick and released that too. That's all I gotta say about Self-Portrait. I think it has potentially risen in people's favor just because now they're like, oh, he made a folk covers album or whatever. It's not that he made a folk covers album. It's that he did it so poorly. And did it so intentionally. Like, he made an awful album in order to try and shed his audience. To be like, the ones who are dedicated and are going to see me through and know what I'm about are going to stick around after this. And everyone else who is expecting me to be the big spokesman for their social cause and movement, I'm going to make this album. It's going to suck. And then they will all leave and stop caring about me. And that's what he did with Self-Portrait. And why on earth, then, would I ever put it... actually, I'm going to be bold here and say it's not an F. There are worse Dylan albums out there, and we'll get to them. But I'm going to put it in the D tier, because it is still... It's intentionally bad. It's an intentionally bad album. He made an album that was meant to make people go, this sucks. I mean, it's like... There's that classic infamous review in Rolling Stone magazine where Greil Marcus opened the review with the line, "What is this shit?" So it was meant to be bad. It's an album that's meant to be bad, and in that sense, I think he succeeded. But there's not much I have to say about Self-Portrait. It is a chore to listen through, an easy skip. I don't recommend it to anyone. And beyond that, we then get into New Morning, which came out a couple of months later. So New Morning to me feels more like the actual real follow-up to Nashville Skyline. It is definitely, it's the return of Dylan singing in his voice, though it has gotten noticeably lower in the intervening years. Instead of it being this high-pitched whine, now it's a low-pitched whine, which I think actually makes it a little bit of an improvement. I think that might be sacrilege to say, but I think the fact that he goes from trying to be a tenor to being a more natural baritone, I think really gave his sense of melody and staying in tune a lot more resonance. It hits deeper with his voice going into a more gruff, hearty thing. I honestly feel like his voice in the early to mid 70s was the best his singing voice ever sounded. But besides that, New Morning, it's got a more full-fledged production. It was viewed of as the time as his big comeback album. Now the public opinion has kind of shifted on it over the years, just because it's not the most amazing record he's put out in his catalog. It's definitely got moments that don't work on it, like the sort of vocal jazz doo-wop bop of If Dogs Won't Run Free, and sort of very, very forgettable filler like Sign on the Window or Three Angels. But then there's a lot of stuff I like on it. If Not For You is a great track. It got turned into a pop classic by George Harrison later that year. I like Winterlude. It's very simple, but very direct and very catchy. The Man in Me has got... it became famous for being the theme song to The Big Lebowski. It also has a very kind of emotional core at the lyrics. I like the Elvis Parable song, which I can't recite the title of because it's got a not great title. But all in all, New Morning, there's not much to say about New Morning. I think it's solid enough as it is. As a Dylan record, I think it's pretty solid. But it didn't leave much of an impact on the greater music scene as a whole, and kind of left people wondering about Dylan for many years, since he started to go a little bit slow and scant on the record releasing after this point. I would put it probably it's in B tier. You know, I would put it right in between Another Side of Bob Dylan and The Times They Are Changing. I think that is decent enough placing, for me at least, and feel free to disagree. But I will maintain there's enough good stuff on New Morning, and I think it's aged better than Times They Are Changing to a degree. It's not as artistically relevant as Neverside, though. And it's just solid. It's a solid album. Nothing too miraculous, but a solid Dylan album, none the same. All right, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Let's talk about this. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid was released in the early part of 73. I think mostly recorded in 72. I could be wrong about that. It is okay. But it's a soundtrack album, and do not ignore the fact that it's a soundtrack album. The reality is that this Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, there's a lot on that record which is instrumental, which is film cue music. There's like 3 different versions of the main theme tune, but it's also got Knocking on Heaven's Door on it, which became like one of the biggest concert anthems ever written by anyone. But that being said, it's hard to say. I think it works. It's got good stuff on it, but it's not that big a giant artistic statement. It's just a film soundtrack. It's got genius stuff on it, but it's a film soundtrack. So I'm prepared. Oh, I can see people getting mad at me about this too. I'm going to put it in... Knocking on Heaven's Door puts it to C tier, but it could very easily go in D tier. I want that to be known. It could very easily be a D tier album, but I just didn't feel like it. Here's an easy F. You know what's worse than Dylan making an album intentionally bad? His record company then taking the outtakes of the album that he made to be intentionally bad and putting it out without his approval to punish him for signing to a different record label. F. It sucks. Whatever redeeming values people might have about Self-Portrait, they are non-existent on the 1973 Dylan album. He didn't want it out. He had nothing to do with its release. It's outtakes from the Self-Portrait album, and it blows. It's an easy F. Easy F of an album. And then moving on from there, we have Planet Waves. Now, Planet Waves, to me, Planet Waves, I would say most likely is the start of Dylan's mid-70s comeback. People tend to kind of underrate this album, I feel like. The dumbest critique I've heard of Planet Waves is that people say it's too homespun. It's Dylan being too domestic. To which I say, what does that even mean, and have you heard the band before? And I think that might be the issue there, is that Planet Waves is another collab with the band, but not like the Basement Tapes, even though the Basement Tapes, the band kind of got shoved on to be more present than they were. On Planet Waves, the band act purely as session musicians, but they're superb dynamic session musicians, and probably the best session musicians Dylan ever had in his career. I mean, like, the stars on Planet Waves, here's what might be the big detracting element for people about Planet Waves. The star on Planet Waves is not Dylan. The star is Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson and Garth Hudson, who perform their asses off on that record. It's superb. I mean, if the songs on Planet Waves were sung by Levon, Richard, and Rick, if that had been a band album, if Planet Waves had come out as a band album where Dylan wrote the material for them, people would view it as one of the band's best albums. It would be up there with the first 2 band albums. But it came out as a Dylan album with Dylan on lead, and so people got a bit more harsh on it, I think, than they really had any right to be. Because, goodness gracious me, I mean, the first half of Planet Waves alone, On a Night Like This, is amazing. Tough Mama swings hard. Going Gone is a great track. Hazel is really beautiful. That both versions of Forever Young have their own merits. The ballad version soars tremendously, and the fast version gives the band the chance to really prove their chops. Even like the song Dirge, which is just a piano piece with Dylan and Robbie Robertson on guitar, kind of acts as a prelude to the emotions and feeling that will become present on Blood on the Tracks. It does trail off toward the end, though. I mean, there are songs. Something There Is About You never really leaves much of an impression. You Angel You doesn't really leave much of an impression. Wedding Song, I wanted to be a wedding song. I don't know if it ever succeeded in that course. It's definitely I think it's way stronger than people give it credit for. It's not a humongous statement. It's like New Morning for me, you know. And to that end, I will probably place it right above New Morning, right there. I still think Another Side of Bob Dylan is probably better, but to me, it's people sleep on Planet Waves, and I don't know why they do that. And I think it's honestly just because it comes right before two of Dylan's best albums, but it's really worth another listen. The musicality on that record, and Dylan's voice, and the joy in the performances, the spirited nature of the performances really make it, you know, it's a pretty decent one. I'd say a sleeper hit in his discography there. I mean, it was his first number one album, so I mean, like, it couldn't have been the worst thing ever, so. And from there, Blood on the Tracks. This is another very easy one. Boop right there in the S tier. And I'm putting it a little bit below I'm putting it a little bit below Blonde on Blonde. But honestly, between the Blood on the Tracks and Blonde on Blonde, it's a close competition for what is the best Dylan album. I will make no bones about this. Blood on the Tracks, to me, is the album that won Dylan the Nobel Prize. The lyricism on it is genius. It's love songs. It's a love songs album, but they're not happy love songs. They're bitter love songs. These are songs about feelings betrayed, friendships broken, vulnerability and sadness and an anger, you know, winding tales of lovers scorned and, you know, feelings hurt and people abandoned. I mean, everything on it is genius. Like, just absolutely genius. And to the point where I've honestly never found anyone who wrote love lyrics like the ones on Blood on Tracks, who did them with such finesse and skill and heart and emotion and poetry. It's deep. It cuts deep. And I think what possibly puts it below Blonde on Blonde for me, I keep saying Blood on Blonde. I think what possibly puts Blood on the Tracks a little bit below Blonde on Blonde for me is that I think if there's one detriment to the album, it's that it's an example. It's the start of Dylan rethinking himself. Hi there. Hope you're having fun. But it's the start of Dylan really, like, sort of going back. There's the classic story of he recorded the bulk of the album he recorded all the album in New York, had it cut to acetate, had the sleeve made up, had the cover art ready, had Columbia ready to ship it out for release. It was going to come out in December 1974. And then at the very last second, he pulled the plug. And he played an early copy to his brother. His brother said, I don't hear a hit in this. He recut half the album with Minnesota Players. And in doing so, he made what I would say is a more commercial record, which is probably what he needed at the time. But the vulnerability and the hurt and the pain of the songs, the original visceral feelings that you get from the New York sessions, gets a little bit diluted. There's some songs that are better for it. Like, I prefer Idiot Wind in its Minnesota recording. And the recut he did in Minnesota, Idiot Wind burns with an fiery, rage-filled passion that isn't as present on the New York sessions. Similarly, Tangled Up in Blue became a great single when he recut it, though it did lack the difference in third person to first person narrative shift in the lyrics. And then, like, If You See Her Say Hello works pretty well in both versions. You're a Big Girl Now works pretty well in both versions. The only song I think really gets ruined by the recut is Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts. That is the song. If you listen to the New York version of Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts, it's like a play happening before you. Like, if you really just close your eyes and listen to Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts, and in its New York version, it's like this cinematic, obtuse art house play happening in your mind. It really is something else. When he recut it, he cut some verses, made the band play it like a country hoedown, and that's all to its detriment. It doesn't work as well in the version that came out on Blood on the Tracks. But, I mean, God, everything else on there, like Shelter from the Storm is genius. Simple Twist of Fate is genius. You're Gonna Make Me Lonesome When You Go is genius. Buckets of Rain is genius, despite what Bette Midler did to it. Even Meet Me in the Morning is just a simple blues track, but it cuts hard like a knife. There's not much to say. Top 10 bombs. Hi, Robin. Yeah, I'm prepared to say it's a tough call for me between Blonde on Blonde and Blood on the Tracks. I think people will maybe get more out of Blood on the Tracks, but Blonde on Blonde to me is the better album. It's the more definitive Dylan record, but it's close. It's very, very close. And I will maintain Blood on the Tracks is the Dylan album that netted him the Nobel Prize. No question about it. And so from there, we move into Desire, recorded in 1975 and released in 1976. To me, Desire is best described as the Rolling Thunder review on album. He recorded it with like a whole bunch of friends that he knew in the village in Greenwich Village. The big main star of that record is Scarlett Riviera and her violin, which interweaves its way through all of the songs in this really gorgeous, haunting way. I mean, it gives the record a character unlike any other Dylan record that is just so intriguing and so rewarding to return to. It's also the start of Dylan co-writing with people, turning to other lyricists and being like, hey, what if you tried this? So that's where we get tracks like Isis and Romance in Durango and Black Diamond Bay. These sort of long-winded narratives that are full of like vivid imagery, but are a bit more direct and streamlined than when Dylan tries to make his own story tale on record. So it's definitely up there. What people have against this, what puts this album down a bit is that it's a bit more scattershot in release. There are some songs which aren't amazing. I would say probably the most guilty offender of that is the song Joey, which is 11 minutes long. It's the song dedicated to Joey Gallo, the famous gangster. And it just doesn't land the way Dylan wants it to, melodically or lyrically. I think it would have been better if he'd put on outtakes like Abandoned Love or Rita May. They would have really helped bolster the album a lot up. But like, I mean, like Hurricane's on that album. Hurricane opens the album, and that's like a genius song. It's like it actually plays out like a play. You know, it's this amazing protest song about Reuben Carter and being like jailed for crimes that he didn't commit. And I mean, it opens up, it describes the whole thing as like a playwright would, you know, pistol shots ring out in the ballroom night, enter Patty Valentine from the upper hall. Like, it's characters. It treats this case like a sort of theatrical thing happening before you, and it gives it this sense of urgency, which makes it really, really powerful to listen to. All things considered, I would put it likely. I would say it's an A tier Bob Dylan album. I think Freewheeling probably does more and had a bigger effect on the course of popular music, but Desire is really up there. It just sits in the shadow of Blood on the Tracks too much, which is to its detriment. But man, it's got a sound to it. I mean, come on, One More Cup of Coffee is one of the most haunting songs of the rock movement of the 70s. There's this, I could go on that album. I think what possibly also holds it back a little bit is that he went out with the Rolling Thunder Review that same year, and I think a lot of the live takes that you hear on the Live 75 package, where he's being backed up by the same musicians, but also like Mick Ronson from the Spiders from Mars, and Bob Newirth, and Joan Baez, and Ramblin' Jack Elliott, and Roger McGuinn of the Byrds. Like, it's just the songs on Desire feel way more fleshed out live than they did on record for me. But anyway, that's Desire. Now we start entering into the tricky period with Dylan. Whereas you could say his early 70s work had some like merits to them, which only became more prevalent in hindsight. Hindsight has not been kind to the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 albums of Dylan's here. So he had a rough 1980s. But before we even get into the 1980s, Street Legal from 1978. This album is a tricky one. There's songs on it that people like, and it's in classic Dylan fashion. Street Legal sits as one of those albums that people go, well, when you hear it like 7 times, then you're able to really hear the genius within it. Like, to me, here's the issue with Street Legal. I think there are songs on it that are good. Changing of the Guards is really all right. Journey Through Dark Heat, Where Are You Tonight, the closing track, is really, really good. But, like, a lot of the stuff in between it. And I don't know if it's the songwriting. I don't know if it's the production. I don't know if it's the arrangement. But a lot of it doesn't land for me. And maybe not so much on a lyrical level, but, like, in terms of the song arrangement and the way it's produced, it feels very Vegas to me. It is like he overproduced. I don't know if Dylan did or Don DeVito, who's credited as record producer on this record, but there's too much stuff. There's sax solos, there's like gospel choirs, there's like all sorts of stuff. It is very much Dylan as Vegas Review. And the thing with Dylan is that he is someone who benefits from a little bit of production, but you don't want to give him too much. You want to make sure that he's in the sweet spot of having natural space to breathe, but also like being guided to produce the best record he can. And Street Legal takes it a bit too far into the slick category for me. So I'm prepared to put it in... Ooh, the real big Dylan fans will disagree with this, but I don't care. I'm going to put it in C tier, right between the debut album and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. I've been told that on re-listen it gets better each time, but to me it's a bit too slick and dense to really work. And then we come into perhaps the most divisive trilogy. So there's, in the S tier up there, you can see we've got the trilogy of the Electric albums. Blonde on Blonde, Highway 61, Bringing It All Back Home. There's 3 trilogies of albums that Dylan has put out in his career. Here we enter into the second one, his Born Again Christian period. Now, putting aside as much as we can are the subjective religious viewpoints of Dylan's conversion to Christianity, I will say this for these albums. They, at the very least, sound the most alive that Dylan had sounded on record for some time. Like, let's start with Slow Train Comin'. Slow Train Comin' has got on it the production of Jerry Wexler, who produced all those classic soul Stax Atlantic records from the 60s. He worked with Aretha, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, like all that 60s classic soul. He's in Muscle Shoals recording with the like Swampers there. So he's got a good band working with him, and he's also got like Mark Knopfler on guitar, and he's coming up with Dire Straits at the time. So it's a good band backing him, and good producer, good production, and the songs themselves are not the worst either. Gotta Serve Somebody's got a good groove to it. Precious Angel swings pretty well. I think I Believe in You became a favorite of Sinead O'Connor's. But there's just a lot. I mean, the thing is that Dylan's version of Christianity is very, very evangelical. And if you are not a believer in that, it's going to be hard for you to get past it. So I'm prepared just with this. I'm going to put it probably C tier. I like the performances on it, and the band he's got is good on it. But lyrically, it is, if you are not a believer in his Christianity, it is going to be hard for you to find stuff to like in it. Saved is even worse, and I'm prepared actually to put Saved underneath Self-Portrait, because, I mean, just look at that. Look at that cover art. Look at that cover art. If that is not the most preachy fucking cover art you've ever seen. Actually, no, I'm prepared. It's worse than Self-Portrait. Self-Portrait was meant to be bad, but Saved is like, it's so fucking preachy. It's such a preachy album. If you are not a believer in his Fire and Brimstone version of God, then it is hard to sit through. It is, of the three Christian albums, it's easily the preachiest and the worst. Shot of Love then comes after it in 1981, and it is not that much better than Saved, and it's definitely worse than Slow Train Comin', but it's an interesting situation because Shot of Love is where he starts to lose interest in his religion. There's still Jesus tracks on it. Like, Every Grain of Sand is the one people point to as being the good one of his Christian stuff. But then the rest of it is just kind of... It feels very much like he's losing interest in his born-again beliefs, and also he starts bringing in more regular songs, but they aren't very good, and the ones that were good, like Caribbean Wind, were cut or put on B-sides like Room Still Waiting at the Altar. It's somewhere. It's in the middle. I think it's above Self-Portrait just because its high moments are all right, but it's not that great an album. And then he follows it up in 83 with Infidels. Now, this was, at the time, viewed of as the big return to form because it was his first secular album since 1978. Infidels, to me, is interesting because it might be... not might be, it is. It is one of the most frustratingly humongous missed opportunities in Dylan's catalog. There is a great Dylan album struggling to get out of Infidels. But the issue, and this is what's infamous about it, is that he recorded way more material than he could ever put out for this album. And then he chose the wrong tracks. He just chose the wrong songs. Like, Joker Man is pretty good, and Sweetheart Like You is alright. And then after that, there's just a lot of stuff that was not good that he put on the album. And there was a whole bunch of stuff that would have been great. Consider this, that in the same sessions of Infidels, he recorded Someone's Got a Hold of My Heart, Lord Protect My Child, which would have been a return to Christianity, but... and then Blind Willie McTell. I mean, he recorded Blind Willie McTell in the Infidels sessions and then left it off the album. Why? that is the frustrating thing about Infidels, is that it is a Dylan record that could have been so much better than what it came out as. But he put on stuff that's not very good, like Neighborhood Bully and Union Sundown. Like, these songs which don't really land too well and just don't work. I would probably put it in C tier, just because I respect it for the album that it's trying to be. I think it's better than Street Legal just because it has better production and its high moments are higher than the ones on Street Legal for me. But, like, it's just a big missed opportunity. It's one that could have been so much better if he had chosen the right material, but he didn't choose the right material, and as it came out, it was big missed chance. And from there we get Empire Burlesque, one of the more divisive entries in his catalog. It's infamous for its state-of-the-art production. This is when you really get the sense of Dylan that he's struggling to find his place in the 1980s. And he's layering as much big, heavy production as he can and giving it that kind of Miami Vice sort of sound. There are people who really like the album in a similar way to... I mean, this is, again, the thing with Dylan in this point in his career. It's that people go, there's good songs that are on it, but you have to hear it again and again and again to find them. And that is a waste to me. He recut Someone's Got a Hold of My Heart for the album, rewrote all the lyrics, filled it with a bunch of Humphrey Bogart references, and then titled it Tight Connection to My Heart. And that was a mistake. He had a great song on there called When the Night Comes Falling from the Sky, which if you hear it on the bootleg series CDs, he cut a version of it with like the E Street Band. That would have been tremendous. And then instead put out this like very like Phil Collins-esque sounding version, which doesn't work at all. The highlight of the record, honestly, is the closing track, which is Dark Eyes. And it's the highlight because it's a good song that's just Dylan on acoustic guitar and harmonica. And there's no one else getting in the way of the song, so you can actually hear it for the good song that it is. So it's probably above Shot of Love, but below Slow Train Coming for me. It is definitely D tier. And now, here we go. Knocked Out Loaded. I don't think I'm breaking anyone's hearts when I put it in the F tier. It's not very good. This is the start, and while we're at it, let's just throw Down in the Groove there as well. And we'll put it below Knocked Out Loaded. These two albums, there's not much to say about Knocked Out Loaded or Down in the Groove. They lack inspiration. The best moments on each of them, I mean, Brownsville Girls on Knocked Out Loaded, and again, that's a song that people say is genius. I'm not a big fan of it. I think it goes on for way too long. I think the overpowering production smothers whatever coherency it could have had. Down in the Groove is even less lacking in inspiration, though I will say the highlight on that one is Silvio, which he co-wrote with Robert Hunter, which I prefer that song to Brownsville Girl, but it doesn't save either of those records. Neither of them are pretty good. They're easily the nadir of Dylan's discography, I would say. Which brings us to 1989 and Oh Mercy. Oh Mercy is definitely Dylan getting back on track. It helps that he got Daniel Lanois to produce the record. And he spent a lot of time, Dylan in his autobiography spent a lot of time detailing the production of the record, which seemed pretty contentious from what you read in that book. It was definitely Daniel Lanois saying to Dylan, you can do better, you can do better, you can do better, and Dylan not believing he could do any better. And because of that, what we get on Oh Mercy is Daniel Lanois pushing Dylan to stop mucking about and make a good record. And because of that, you get a good record. I mean, it's a very good record. It's like Political World opens it up, and it's a great track. Most of the time, hits deep. I mean, when you hear it in High Infidelity, it hits the moment of that scene really, really well. Ring Them Bells is a great track. Everything is Broken is a great track. Is like Shooting Star really works well. Man in the Long Black Coat has got this really like moody atmospheric thing going for it. It's a solid Dylan record. I would put it probably. I'm prepared to put it in the B tier between Another Side and Planet Waves. I think that's probably an appropriate placement for it. As the record it came out as, I should say. It's definitely, it's a good return to form to Dylan, but it's one that I don't think he recognized for being as good as it was. It's a very interesting situation because I think it's Dylan making a good album, but because he was prodded into making one. And not necessarily because he was left to his own devices and had a sudden artistic reawakening. I think because Daniel Lanois really pushed him to be making stuff that was worthy of being a Bob Dylan album, it came out really, really superb and spectacular, and that's why I'm very fond of it. Anyway, but here's the clue to why Oh Mercy might have not have been Dylan really making a great record because he could make a great record is that after it, the next year, we get Under the Red Sky, which falls into a similar category as the other Dylan albums of the 80s, which is that people who like it go, oh, no, it gets good. I implore those who have listened to Under the Red Sky, please defend the validity of Wiggle Wiggle to me. Like, really, I dare you. Because that Wiggle Wiggle is the kind of song which will make people question if Dylan really was deserving of that Nobel Prize. You know? Like, to go from the lyrics on records like Blonde on Blonde or Highway 61 Revisited or Blood on the Tracks to then, you know, like the lyrics on Under a Red Sky where he's got the title song where he's pretty much describing the Hansel and Gretel story. You know, there was a young boy and there was a little girl, and one day the boy and the girl got baked into a pie. Like that's not very, it's not top tier Dylan for me. And if that's what and that song's considered a highlight of the album, what even? So I'm probably put it at D tier. I think it's above Empire Burlesque just a little bit, but it's tricky. It's a tricky one. I am not a believer in that album. I think it is definitely Dylan regaining his lack of artistic footing, I guess is what you would say in that scenario, which is unfortunate. And the response to it at the time wasn't superb either. And at the time, made Dylan believe that he wasn't going to write songs anymore. I think this sort of 1-2 punch of having to struggle to make a good record with Oh Mercy, and then when left back to his own devices again, making a not impressive one with Under the Red Sky, led him to just go, okay, I'm just not going to try anymore. And thus, because of that, we then get a pair of albums in the early 90s, which are covers records. We get Good As I've Been to You and World Gone Wrong. I'm going to tackle both of these pretty much simultaneously because they're pretty much of a piece of each other. The thing with these albums, they're better than Under the Red Sky, but I think the issue is that because they're covers records, they lack... Well, this is a stupid sentence to say. They lack originality because they're covers records. And the reason why people listen to Dylan and like Dylan in the first place is because of his songwriting. You know, like, it's not... There will always be this thing with Dylan where he will try to portray himself as just a performer. But his voice is not his strong suit. I like his voice. I'm acclimated to his rough sounding voice, but that's not his, greatest moments. His greatest moments are when he writes a genius lyric and puts it into a genius song. So there's always that dichotomy with me with Dylan. So that boils down to, there's not much to say about Good As I've Been to You and World Gone Wrong. I think they work well on a performance level. For as much as I just said, I don't know how he is as a performer, they work well on a performance level. So, Good As I've Been to You, I would put probably above Under the Red Sky, but below Slow Train Comin'. And then World Gone Wrong, I would put above Slow Train Comin', but below Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. I think what it boils down to is that on Good As I've Been to You, he works more from a folk template, whereas on World Gone Wrong, he goes more for a blues template. And I think the blues template suits Dylan better than just the simple folk template, especially because by the 90s, his voice was getting very well worn. Still had a little bit of tonality in it, but getting very well worn. And then 97 brings us Time Out of Mind. Now, Time Out of Mind is an interesting case study. This album, Time Out of Mind, really, to some people, kicked off Dylan's late career renaissance. And I agree to a certain extent. My issue with Time Out of Mind is that we see the return of Daniel Lanois, and he, I think, oversteps his boundaries a little bit as a producer. The same way Don DeVito did on Street Legal. He shrouds all the songs in this really, artsy for art's sake echo, which doesn't necessarily work for the majority of it. But putting that aside, I mean, Time Out of Mind was easily Dylan's most solid set of numbers since Desire. There was no question of it. It was his most solid set of material. Lovesick made for a great opener. Trying to Get to Heaven and Standing in a Doorway were really good album deep cuts. Highlands was this long winding piece that I wasn't up there with stuff like Desolation Row or anything, but was pretty interesting. And then you had that nucleus in the middle of the record, which was so powerful to listen to. And I'm talking about 3 songs: Not Dark Yet, Cold Irons Bound, and Make You Feel My Love. Those 3 songs were better than anything Dylan had written in the past 15 years. Or even more so, but maybe even the past, 20 years. You get Not Dark Yet, which is this very, slow, ruminative statement. It's a guy in middle age, bordering on senior citizen territory, kind of saying to himself, if not intentionally, then at the very least, metaphorically going, my youth is over. I'm accepting that. I'm not gonna pretend like I can still be young. I'm getting ready to prep myself for becoming the kind of person who I was protesting against when I was young, when I could write something like Times They Are a Changin' and be get out of the new road if you can't lend your hand. I'm Not Dark Yet is a statement of him being I'm gonna get out of the way. I'm gonna do my thing. I can tell that, the modern world is gonna change and I'm gonna get lost in the shuffle, but I'm just gonna do what I can while I'm there. And it's not dark yet, but it's getting there. That is a very powerful song. Follows it up with Cold Irons Bound. It swings. And it swings. It's got that amazing bass groove that is so up in the mix, it hits you like a steamroller. It is just... And then just the band lets loose on it, and it's so murderous and gloomy, but really, really powerful at the same time. It hits hard. And then he follows it up, caps off that trilogy with Make You Feel My Love, which is it became a modern standard, which is something that's very rare these days. But that's an example of a Dylan song more so even than stuff like Don't Think Twice as It's Alright, or like Tangled Up in Blue, or Just Like a Woman, or any of the other love songs he'd written before this. Like, Make You Feel My Love became like the Dylan song that people will play at weddings and things. I think it certainly helps that then Adele covered it on her debut album 10 years later, and then it was this humongous thing. But like Michael Bolton has sung, Make You Feel My Love. Like, it became very like a sort of, here's the romantic standard in Dylan's discography. And after like a decade and a half of him putting out like really, really mediocre material, to then suddenly in the like sort of start of his autumn years come out with a song like Make You Feel My Love was like, whoa, where the heck did that come from? So that's the sort of, Time Out of Mind really holds up as like one of his better records. I think on a production level it doesn't necessarily land the way it wants to. I'm prepared to put it in the A tier, honestly. I think it's up there as an A tier Dylan record. Just because like it was really like a guy returning to his strengths after like spending all of the 80s and the majority of the 90s and the latter half of the 70s like struggling to find inspiration. To have it hit so hard like that was really powerful. And then we open up the new millennium, the 21st century. We open up with Love and Theft. Now, if Time Out of Mind signaled the start of a late career renaissance comeback for Dylan, I think Love and Theft really solidified it. It doesn't have the Landwall production. It's the start of Dylan producing his own records again himself. He strips it down to just simple, bare, barroom blues. It's the kind of stuff you would hear like at a local club or at a local like restaurant or diner sort of situation. There's like really great songs on it. I mean, Mississippi is great. Tweedledee Dum Tweedledee Dee is really great. Summer Days is pretty good. High Water for Charlie Patton's like this really menacing blues. Like there's a lot of good stuff. I think what puts Love and Theft ahead of Time Out of Mind for me is two things. One, I think the production is better. I think the production is more stripped back, and in doing so allows the band to let loose a little bit more. And two, it honestly reconnects Dylan with his sense of humor, which he has. Dylan has a sense of humor, and you can hear it in a couple of his lyrics. He just doesn't bring it out often. But it's there all over Love and Theft. It's very present, and you can hear him kind of returning to... So he feels more comfortable and self-assured with himself on the record. And I would put it there. It's above Time Out of Mind. It's an A-tier Dylan record, pretty easily, I would say. It's definitely one of his more solid efforts. I would say of the records he's put out in the past 20 years, it's likely the best. It's the one, I would say, if you want to hear what Dylan's up to in the new 21st century, Love and Theft holds up pretty spectacularly well. And so from there, we get Modern Times. Now, Modern Times is interesting. It came out in 2006. It really got tremendous amounts of praise heaped onto it. I have mixed feelings on Modern Times. I think it's good. I would be so bold even as to say it's Dylan's last truly great album. However, it's the start of a trend that persists to this very day, which I do not like with Dylan, which is that he's starting to get a little bit lax on the songwriting. More than a couple of songs have melodies that he pinched from old blues songs, whether it be Muddy Waters or Elmore James or Robert Johnson or whoever. But there's more than a couple of songs that he took the melodies from old blues stuff, and he took the lyrics from like long forgotten poets from the 1800s. So it's not the most original Dylan album out there, and that is to its detriment. He would like sort of, he's working now, this is a format which he's still working in today, which is that he will take a bass line of, here's the melody of an old blues song, and here's some lyrics I cribbed from
old poets from before the age that anyone listening to my records will recognize. And I'm going to maybe change a note of a song here, or I'm going to change a line from a poem already written here. And then I'm going to put my name on the publishing credits and get the money for it. So, on that sense, it's the start of Dylan kind of acting as a bit of a rehash of old Americana, which is, he's better than that, but that's what he's doing and what he has been doing for some time. So, I would say it's probably B tier. I'm going to put it here in the B tier. I still think it's a decent one, and I think it's his best one in some time, but it's definitely not the most original Dylan record, and it will be the start of him kind of, subtly phoning it in here and there, which is to his detriment, because he's capable of great things, but he needs to be aware of that. He needs to be made aware of that sometimes. Anyway, from there, Together Through Life. Together Through Life, people treat it as like some grand drop-off in quality. I don't know where they're coming from. I think it's relatively on a melodic level, I think it's relatively on a similar pace with Together Through Life. I think it doesn't have the sense of importance that the previous three albums did. It doesn't pertain the same amount of, grandiosity and artistry as Modern Times or Love and Theft or Time Out of Mind. It just is sort of an album that he kind of threw out really quickly, and then that was it. Robert Hunter, who is the lyricist for Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead, wrote the bulk of the lyrics on it, and I think that's probably to the record's detriment. I don't know if it really helps it stand out too prevalently. Beyond Here Lies Nothing opens up the record, and it's a pretty good track. I don't know. I would say it's C tier. I would put it above World Gone Wrong, but it's a bit below Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. That seems about right. Christmas in the Heart. Bob Dylan making a Christmas album is the sort of thing that should be a joke and never discussed further beyond that. So, boop, there you go, in the D tier. I mean, he tries a little bit. Do you remember when he did the Must Be Santa video? And he opens the album, I think. If he doesn't open it, then it's somewhere on. He does a version of Must Be Santa where he, in the middle of it, he's, reciting the names of the reindeer, but then he throws in, Kennedy and Nixon in there. And I'm like, is that a political statement of some kind? What does that mean? That's a sign of where he's at on Christmas in the Heart. It's, I don't know. If you have the sick curiosity of wanting to hear Bob Dylan do a Christmas record, I say go for it, pick it up. But come on, it's Bob Dylan doing a Christmas record. There are better things to be listening to. And from there we get Tempest. Tempest, to me, I like it more. Let's put it here. I think it's above Street Legal and below Infidels. Tempest had good stuff on it. I remember that coming out. This is the first Dylan album, really. That's not fair. I remember Modern Times coming out and Together Through Life coming out, but Tempest was the first Dylan I bought on the first Dylan album I bought on release, because it came out when I was in high school, and it's pretty solid. It's definitely one of his darkest records. I mean, the title track is a long, depiction of the Titanic sinking. He's got stuff on there like Duquesne Whistle. Pay in Blood is really good. But, there's also stuff on it, it ends with this, John Lennon tribute song that doesn't really land pretty well. It's a little bit too lengthy, I would say. I think it's a little bit... It could have used some pruning down to maybe the best 6 tracks, and then we would have had a really good late stage Dylan album on our hands, but it's all right for what it is. Next 3 albums I'm gonna just blow right through because there's not much to say, and I'm gonna put them here in the D tier: Shadows in the Night, Fallen Angels, and Triplicate. Here's the thing: if Dylan doing a Sinatra covers album had been limited to just Shadows in the Night, maybe it would rank higher in its placing, but it's Dylan doing a Sinatra covers album. It's Dylan doing 5 Sinatra covers albums because Triplicate is 3 albums long. So he went most of the 2010s. He went pretty much all the 2010s just doing Sinatra covers, which is really obnoxious because he's not a crooner. Despite what he may think, he's not a crooner of a singer. And him doing Sinatra covers is really tedious to me. It's I just can't get into it. And there's maybe some people will disagree with that, but like, I don't know. It's one thing if you're doing, let me put it this way. It's one thing if you're doing a covers album as your debut. It's one thing if you're doing a covers album that's steeped in the blues. It's one thing if you're pulling from your roots to do a covers album of folk songs. It's quite another thing if you're pulling from the Great American Songbook of Sinatra, or if you're trying to intentionally piss off your audience. So I would say putting the past 3 albums, the past 3 albums he did in the 2010s in the D tier feels about right to me. And then Rough and Rowdy Ways, this came out in June. Some people are really into this album. I am not. I did not like Murder Most Foul. I did not like I Contain Multitudes. I really feel like Rough and Rowdy Ways is a tossed off album to me. Feels a little bit tossed off. Potentially, I mean, like, this could be his last album because he's now 79 and, you know, things are pretty crazy right now. Cover art isn't even very good. I mean, I could do that cover art in like 15 minutes on Photoshop, and so could you. I don't know. He went for what was, I think, Leonard Cohen. I think he went for something that like Leonard Cohen on Leonard Cohen's final album, which is that he has the band doing these very like soft, slow grooves, and then he kind of does spoken word recitations on top of it. But like, I want more than that from Dylan. I expect better of him than that. So I don't know. I think it's maybe a little bit better than Together Through Life, just because it's a little bit more original than when he's working with Robert Hunter, but ooh, do I? But you know what? Honestly, think I'm prepared to say this. Ooh, it's down. Where do I put it between Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid? How much clout does Knocking on Heaven's Door really have? You know what? Heck it. I'm gonna put it above Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, just because while I don't think there's anything on Rough and Rowdy Ways that surpasses Knocking on Heaven's Door, it is at the very least though a more full-fledged album than Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. So that, folks, is the Bob Dylan tier list. So let's look at what we got here. S tier would be Blonde on Blonde. Well, okay, S tier is Blood on the Tracks and the mid-60s Electric trilogy of albums. That seems about right. I think that's probably appropriate. I think that's correct. A tier is Freewheelin', Desire, Love and Theft, and Time Out of Mind. So you have the big opening salvo to the career, the continuation of the 70s comeback, and the 2 best moments of the late career renaissance. That feels about appropriate to me too. B tier, Basement Tapes, John Wesley Harding, Another Side of Bob Dylan, Modern Times, No Mercy, Planet Waves, New Morning, Times They Are Changing. I could see potentially bumping Basement Tapes up to A, maybe, but again, if that would be if I was only counting it as the Dylan songs, and I have to reckon with the fact that the band are there too, and their stuff isn't as good, so that has to stay B. John Wesley Harding maybe could go up to A, but I don't like it as much as that. I think this is like the Dylan albums. These are like the Dylan albums which are very good and very solid albums, but have little middling things here and there that don't make it like the creme de la creme of Dylan albums. The C tier list albums: Nashville Skyline, the debut album Infidels, Tempest, Street Legal, Rough and Rowdy Ways, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Care for Your Life, World Gone Wrong, Slow Train Coming In, Good As I've Been to You. I think this is fair too. The C list tier looks to me like the albums which are for the Dylan fans only. These are the ones which are like, yeah, they're the albums that like people who are really hardcore Dylan stans are going to be like, this is genius all the way through it. And then people who aren't as deep into Dylan are going to be like, there's like one or two tracks that are all right, but I don't know about the rest of it. And like, I think all of the records in that tier there really fit that mold pretty well. I think that's probably appropriate and about right. D tier, we got the Sinatra albums, Under a Red Sky, Empire Burlesque, Shot of Love, Christmas in the Heart, Self-Portrait, Saved. I actually might be bold here and put Saved in the F tier, but yeah. But like the stuff we have in the D tier is the albums that I don't think are good. I think most people are ready to say they aren't good. But again, Dylanologists will be like, all right, they're not the best of Dylan, but like there's this here. There are the albums that people go like, you need to hear it like 20 times and then you'll think it's genius. Like that to me is those albums. They have moments of good stuff on them, but they aren't the most superb all the way through. And then the F tier, Saved for its preachiness, Knocked Out Loaded, and Down in the Groove for being pretty awful, and the 1973 Dylan album for being something that Dylan even didn't want out. Outtakes from a lousy album. I would say that's about fair. So that is now, I will say, this is our Dylan tier list. After talking it out for 2.5 hours, that's about right, I would say. So, that's, I think, good for today, honestly. I've been going now. There's not much. I could do maybe a half an hour of a game, but I don't think anyone else is really tuning in. I mean, the viewer count right now is at 1, so I'm prepared to really call it for the day. This was just a simple bonus stream. These music critic review streams I do are never as popular as my gaming streams, but I don't care because that's what I'm here for. I feel after a certain point there'll probably be the people who come in and they'll be like, I think people eventually over time will get that, like, sometimes I want to do streams for me. And hell, this was the bonus stream after all. This is just the one. This is the stream I could do while I wasn't at work and my car was being repaired and I could just do this. And I think this will come out on the Archive VOD channel. And the people who really are going to enjoy this are going to enjoy this. And that's going to be how this goes, and that's gonna be it. So I may do another tier list video. There's a lot of artists I could do tier lists on, and we'll see what happens. I wouldn't expect it too soon. I would say I would say treasure these as like very much one-off things that I do on occasion. I don't foresee this being something I do on the regular too often. This is just something I wanted to do as a nice little bonus thing. I'm glad I did it, and this was fun for me to do, and hopefully some of you who tuned in on occasion will enjoy this. And I'm assuming those of you watching the VOD and the archive who are Dylan fans will get a kick out of this, and you can say where you disagree with me, where you agree with me, and that's about it. I'm not gonna bother with a raid because the viewer count isn't really worth it, and I also don't think anyone I know is streaming right now. I mean, is there anyone streaming at the moment that I could raid? Yeah, but alright. So, and I'm gonna leave that be. Thank you all so much for being here. I will see you all on Saturday, where we will be doing more Mario 64. That will be on Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. But until then, thank you all so much for being here. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye! Bye-bye.